Welcome back, guys, to our second lecture. Today we'll be talking about Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. Remember that Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States. We talked about him before our break, which I know at this point was like 3 weeks ago. So I will refresh you a little bit on Woodrow Wilson. Remember that Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. He was from the South, though he was not born there. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister and would later go on to be the president of Princeton University. So he came from an academic background. Remember that the reason that he won the election was primarily, or the 1912 election, I should say, was primarily because Teddy Roosevelt had split the Republican vote by running as an independent, the Bull Moose. And so Woodrow Wilson had not won a majority, but he had won more than either Taft or Roosevelt. And so he had won the presidency. He campaigned in 1916 specifically on a campaign to keep the United States out of the war, as opposed to his Republican colleagues who had voiced their opinion that the United States probably should join the war. But ironically, in 1917, just a month after his inauguration, Woodrow Wilson declared war. So he campaigned for something and then did almost the exact opposite. Now, in Woodrow Wilson's defense, not that I like him very much. In fact, he's probably my least favorite president of all time. In his defense, situations had changed. So I don't actually fault him for getting us into the war, even though he said he was not going to. He was really in a tough spot there. That being said, Woodrow Wilson is going to do a number of things that's going to change the United States forever. He is going to introduce a number of government programs. He's going to introduce the income tax. He is going to introduce a number of things that I think are quite problematic. Although, on a positive side, it is during his presidency that women do get the right to vote. I did like that part, although he didn't actually really support that because he was from the South again, and the South at that time was relatively backward thinking. So even the good things that happened under his presidency usually were not his doing. That being said, in 1917, when he joined or decided to declare war, or asked Congress rather to declare war on the Empire of Germany, he issued a statement that effectively laid out the 14 points that he wanted to achieve by entering the war. These were the 14 goals of peace. And we're going to go through each one of the 14, and we'll talk about them and whether they worked or whether they were perhaps idealistic and they were not going to work. And I'm going to read the 14 points. I'm also, in the supplementary material for this week, I'm going to put a recording of that speech. I think there are several versions of him actually speaking it because we did have voice recordings at that time. If any of those are high enough quality, I will link those. Otherwise, I'll just find somebody else reading it that sounds nice. I highly encourage you to listen to the entire speech. Do it while you're doing something else. I think it would be fascinating for you to hear it. Let's go ahead and start with point number 1. And the first of the 14 points says this: open covenants of peace openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall always proceed frankly and in the public view. Basically, the first commitment that Woodrow Wilson made is that at the end of the war, all of the nations would get together and they would publicly make an end to the war. There would be no secret clauses. There would be no backroom dealings. Specifically, this is to address problems that occurred in Europe in the last 60 years. There were always these back deals that were being made in exchanges of territories. And, in our treaty to end the war in Europe, we actually divided Africa up as well. Something sneaky like that. So this first point's good. We're going to conduct peace all together. We're going to conduct it in the open. Everybody's going to know what the peace deals are. They're going to be clear. There's not going to be any secret clauses. There's not going to be any sneakiness at all. Let's move on to point number 2. Absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas, outside territorial waters, alike in peace and war, except as the seas may be closed in whole or in part by international action for the enforcement of international covenants. All right, so this is an idea that is quite interesting and not a surprise coming from an American president. This effectively says that the sea from this point forward will always remain open. Now remember the American perspective here. There's 2 major powers in the sea that are causing problems for the Americans. Number 1 is the Germans. The Germans are sinking American ships with their submarines. All right, this point is to eliminate that possibility. You can't sink enemy ships outside of your territorial waters. That's what Woodrow Wilson is hoping. A little bit naive, but I see where he's coming from. But remember that Great Britain actually was also interfering with American trade by saying that you cannot trade with Germany. Remember, there was a blockade. That blockade kept Germans in, but it also kept Americans who wanted to trade with Germany out. And this is also a dig at the British by basically saying that, look, no one can lock down the sea except by, at the very end of the statement, international covenant. In other words, Great Britain can't say, I'm locking this down. People have to get together and agree that this area needs to be blockaded. So, for example, a modern day example of that would be Iran. The United States and most of its allies have agreed that we are not going to allow unrestricted shipment and shipping there. Some people can go, but in general, we're going to restrict access to that place in an embargo. So, again, a little naive to think that this would actually be the case, because remember, a treaty is only as binding as the people actually agreeing to it. So if anybody says, I'm going to ignore this, it's going to get ignored. But again, I think this is a good point. Freedom of navigation is good. It allows nations that are not caught up in a war to continue about their business without worries about having their ships sunk. So we'll give Woodrow Wilson a thumbs up, A+ on his second point. Let's move on to point number 3. The removal, so far as possible, of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade conditions among all the nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. All right, another good point. Right, you're like, wow, man, you said all of them were bad. Okay, well, that's perhaps a bit of an exaggeration. Don't worry, we're getting to the bad ones. Just wait, be patient. But this is a point that most Americans today would definitely agree with, and this is basically free trade, or equal trade at the very least. So in international politics, there is a tool usable by governments to kind of get other governments and other economies to cooperate with them, and that is the tariff. The tariff is effectively an additional tax on foreign goods. So if you are producing a good in your country and you want to ship it over to my country, I give you a tariff of 10%. You have to pay 10% of the production cost of that good. Effectively, I've just made all of your prices go up by 10% because you have to get that money back. That gives my native producers an advantage, even if they're not making as good of products, even if they're selling for more expensive, because you have to pay an extra 10% or 20% or 25%. They usually can sell for cheaper than you, and people are more likely to buy their goods. This is good for the local manufacturers, but it's not necessarily good for international trade, because one of the things that international trade is really good for is spreading the coronavirus. No, I'm just kidding. That was a joke. One of the things that international trade is really good for is connecting a person that can do a job really well at the right price point, the person that wants to buy it. Let's give you some current modern day examples. Let's say that you want to buy clothes. Well, you could spend a lot of money to buy them from a person who made them in America, or you could connect a factory in Vietnam that makes them for much less. Now, this is controversial because the people in Vietnam are not paid very much, although by comparative standards to what the people are making in their country, they're paid quite a bit. But basically what this is doing is it's connecting someone who makes a low-cost product to someone who's willing to buy that product at that price. And this helps international economies grow. Our economy grows, their economy grows, everybody's economies are growing. So this is a good point. Again, one of the issues, though, with this is that, number one, any nation can restrict this if they don't want to do it. But number two, it seems to imply something. I want you to listen to the end again. Among all nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. In other words, this is actually kind of a hidden threat. So free trade part, very good. A+, Woodrow Wilson, good job. The second part, maybe a little bit more suspect. You have to agree to all the other things that I'm going to talk about if you want the free trade. It's kind of like, here's a carrot and here's a stick, and I'm going to try and get you to go in this direction using whatever means necessary. So not necessarily terrible, but just note that there's a little bit of a sneakiness there. Number 14. Adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. All right, here's where we start to get into some of the problematic ones. Again, from an ideological point of view, this sounds really good. Basically, Woodrow Wilson just said, look, we should all get rid of weapons until we have just enough to protect our own borders. But this is a fallacy, and it doesn't work. And let me explain to you a situation where this doesn't work. So let's say that we have two countries. We have Canada and the United States. We're the only two countries. We both say, hey, We don't have any intention of fighting. Let's reduce our military force to as small as possible, just to guarantee that the other guy can't march into our country with his defense force. So we both go down, and we have a really, really small defense force. The problem is that as soon as either nation breaks that agreement, it's very possible that the other nation might be destroyed before they knew what was going on. So let's just use Canada in this example. Canada goes, you know what, I don't like those Americans anymore. I'm going to build my troops very, very quickly. I'm going to try and hide it. And they do. So for a year, they train a bunch of soldiers. They build a lot of tanks. They build a lot of planes. And boom, surprise, we just took everybody out because everybody was agreeing to this. But again, the second that you agree, you decide you don't want to follow it, nobody can stop you, especially if everybody disarmed. Okay, that's the problem here. Some of these other things, if you back out of the treaty, maybe there's military force to stop you. Like, hey, stop doing that. But the problem is, if you only have enough military force to defend yourself, you can't go enforce your will on somebody else. And certainly if someone, I don't know, like Hitler started to produce huge amounts of weaponry, that could cause some serious problems. So this is a bad point. Great on an ideological point of view. If humans were good, that would be great, but humans are not good. In fact, the Bible tells us that humans are desperately wicked. And so I certainly would not trust the other guys to disarm themselves. Okay, so probably a foolish point. Number 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interest of the population concerned must have equal weight with the equitable government whose title is to be determined. All right, now, from an American perspective, number 5, not so terrible. Basically, it says that we're going to adjust all colonial claims. What does this mean? That if a group of people wants independence, they theoretically would get it. Because remember, at the end of that statement, it says the interests of the population concerns must have equal weight. So if the inhabitants of Kenya want freedom from the British, according to Article 5, they're going to get it. The problem is that the absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. Who's impartial? No one's impartial. That's the problem. No one's impartial. So the problem with this is it doesn't go the correct distance in either direction. Number one, Woodrow Wilson could have said, we're ending all colonial claims over the next 30 years. By the way, ending them immediately, disastrous. And when you take geography, you'll see how crazy it is when a European power just walks out of a colony. It's bad. It's bad. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is the example of this, and it's not a good situation. But he could have said, we're ending all colonial claims. I would have supported that as an American. I think that's great. Or he could have said, let's have some self-determination, and the United States will be the judge. That would work. Okay, at least now we have someone who's claiming to be impartial. And the United States has its own colony, so maybe it wasn't. But still, it's probably less impartial than, say, Great Britain, for example. The problem is, he kind of like weaves through the middle. He says, hey, they should get the right to decide, but we need an impartial decider. And who does that? Well, we don't have anybody who's actually impartial. So effectively what this means is nothing. All right, nothing. No one's going to act on this, even though this is part of the peace agreement in World War I. In fact, the British and French actually take more colonies, not less colonies. And they really mess up the Middle East in addition to this. So this does not work. Woodrow Wilson should have gone further with it or should not have included it at all. Number 6, the evacuation of all Russian territory and such a settlement of all questions affecting Russia as will secure the best and freest cooperation of the other nations of the world in obtaining for her an unhampered and unembarrassed opportunity for the independent determination of her own political development and national policy. And, probably a run-on sentence, assure her of a sincere welcome into the society of free nations under the institutions of her own choosing, and more than a welcome, assistance also of every kind that she may need and may herself desire. The treatment accorded Russia by her sister nations in the months to come will be the acid test of their goodwill, of their comprehension of her needs as distinguished from their own interests, and of their intelligent and unselfish sympathy. Okay, there's some things to unpack here. Number 1, this was invalidating the rumored and soon-to-be true pact between Germany and the Russians to effectively end the war. Basically, all Russian territory that belonged to Russia before the war has to be evacuated. In other words, Germany, a separate peace with Russia doesn't stand. If you surrender to us, we're going to make you give it all back. And they did, by the way. That's true. True fact. No problems with that. Germany probably shouldn't have kept that stuff, and if they had, man, Hitler probably would have been way worse. So I think we can agree that's fine. The problem is Woodrow Wilson says we're going to deal with Russia and we're going to allow her into the international community unhampered, unembarrassed, however she chooses. Well, this is just straight up a lie. Woodrow Wilson was the strongest opponent of the Soviet Union that existed in 1920 through 1924. In fact, American troops occupied the Trans-Siberian Railroad and maintained it for the White Russians until their final defeat. So this is just kind of silly. Again, in principle, it sounds fine, but the reality was not true. They didn't accept the Soviet Union in any way, shape, or form. Now, that being said, before you accuse me of liking the communists, I don't like the communists. And I agree with Woodrow Wilson's actions. The problem is what he said and what he did not line up. And that's the problem with the 14 points. It sounds great on paper. Like in an ideal world, this is all great stuff. The problem is we live in like the real world. It doesn't work. And nobody was going to let Russia in. I think when Woodrow Wilson said this, he was anticipating that the monarchy was going to be overthrown and there was going to be like a democracy that breaks out. Again, Woodrow Wilson's a big idealist. That sounds really good. The reality, though, is it's simply not true. Belgium, the whole world will agree, well, that's perhaps a little bit dramatic, must be evacuated and restored without any attempt to limit the sovereignty which she enjoys in common with all other free nations. No other single act will serve as this will serve to restore confidence among the nations in the laws which they themselves set and determine for this government of their relation with one another. Without this healing act, the whole structure and validity of international law is forever impaired. No problems with Article number 7. Belgium needs to be a country again. Germany needs to give her up. Totally fair. All French territory should be freed and the invaded portions restored, and the wrong done to France by Prussia in 1871 in the matter of Alsace-Lorraine, which was unsettled the peace of the world for nearly 50 years, should be righted in order that peace may once more be made secure in the interest of all. All right, number 8, big problem, probably one of the contributing factors to World War II. Alsace-Lorraine is a province between France and Germany. If you've got your Chromebook handy, which you probably do if you're watching this, I'll look up Alsace-Lorraine. That is spelled ALSACE hyphen LORRAINE. Actually, it's two provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, but you can Google it as Alsace-Lorraine, and the Wikipedia page will come up, and you can at least see where it is. Here's the problem. Alsace-Lorraine is one of the most controversial pieces of land in all of human history. Is it German? Is it French? The French say it's French. The Germans say it's German. Everybody else, who knows? The language spoke there is primarily German. However, it has historically been part of France. So, there's these questions. Who does it belong to? The problem with Article 8 is that it is definitely biased against Germany here. And that is a bad negotiating position to start with. And in fact, because Woodrow Wilson took that negotiating position, rather than resolve the issue, they didn't resolve it. They let France take the whole thing. Here's the problem with that. By France taking the entirety of Alsace-Lorraine, they badly offended the Germans. And the Germans were very, very quick to want retribution for this. Because in a German perspective, they'd taken that territory in war fair and square, a war where they had totally defeated the French. On the other hand, they had signed an armistice in World War I, and they'd simply said, we want a ceasefire, we want to stop the fighting, but we're not defeated. We're not toast. We're not ground into the ground. We haven't even given up Alsace-Lorraine. To have it ripped away with basically tacit American support is one of the contributing factors to World War II. So this was a very poor decision. Instead, what Woodrow Wilson probably should have done is just maintained a more neutral stance on it. Perhaps a better solution would have been to divide the territory, give Lorraine to Germany and Alsace to the French, and simply leave it at that. And perhaps that would have helped maintain the peace. But unfortunately, that wasn't done. Number 9, the readjustment of the frontiers of Italy should be effected along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. All right, this is where it starts to get silly. Lines of nationality in the border region of Italy and Austria are absolutely ridiculous. Remember that map I showed you of Austria-Hungary when we talked about the causes of World War I? Yeah, remember that map. It's insane. There is no borders of nationality. This is simply silly, and this was basically a way to kind of punish the Austrians for starting the war. we're going to give some territory to Italy from Austria. Now, at the end of the day, Austria no longer really existed as a nation after World War I because it was broken up. So did this contribute to World War II? No, but it's silly. It's silly. You can't really find the lines of nationality. The Italians themselves had only unified as a nation less than 60 years before this. So even who are the Italians? I mean, that was a new concept. There were people alive that literally had outlived the nation of Italy. In fact, I think, if my numbers are correct, Woodrow Wilson was actually older than the nation of Italy. So this is kind of a silly statement. The people of Austria-Hungary, whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded and assured, oh, that sounds confident, should be accorded the freest opportunity to autonomous development. This is a really ironic one. Number 10. Basically, number 10 is we support the nation of Austria-Hungary, as in we support it breaking up. That's what the end says. So it's just kind of amusing. Now, technically, he does say the people of Austria-Hungary. He doesn't say the nation of Austria-Hungary. But this is definitely kind of like it starts like, yeah, we support Austria-Hungary. We support it determining to become separate nations. Autonomous development, right? Separate development into multiple nations. Which, by the way, despite how funny this statement is worded, I totally agree with Woodrow Wilson in this one. Austria-Hungary definitely needed to be split up. Unfortunately, by splitting it up, it did create more tension, but I'm not sure that keeping it together would have created less tension, for the record. So it was kind of a situation where it didn't matter what you did. They probably all had bad results. Number 11, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro should be evacuated, occupied territory restored. Serbia accorded free and secure access to the sea, and the relation of several Balkan states to one another determined by friendly counsel along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality, and international guarantees of the political, economic independence, and territorial integrity of the several Balkan states should be entered into. Now, this is an area where Woodrow Wilson really did not want to go into. This is trying to fix the problems of the Balkan Peninsula, which historically in Europe have been the most complex, convoluted, and difficult to figure out area of the entire world. Specifically, this guarantee that Serbia ought to have access to the sea was going to require, at the very least, redrawn borders, as you could already say about establishing historically established lines. Where do populations end in the Balkans? It's incredibly complex. There are so many people groups, different languages, even different religions. The Bosnians and the Albanians, having a large Muslim population in addition to everything else that's going on there. There are some stable and more established countries in Eastern Europe, such as Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, but even those nations had been all over the place in the war. Bulgaria had joined the Central Powers. Romania had fought on the side of the Allies and had been overrun. Incredible complexity, and really the Americans had no business being in this, simply because I don't think anybody but the nations in the Balkans themselves could have figured this out. Certainly Woodrow Wilson, talking in Washington, having never been to this location in the world, could have figured this out. Number 12, the Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but the other nationalities which are now under Turkish rule should be assured an undoubted security of life, an absolute unmolested opportunity of autonomous development, and the Dardanelles should be permanently opened as a free passage to the ships and commerce of all nations under international guarantees. Let's unpack this. The Ottoman Empire was built of several different groups, including the Armenians and the Arabs. The Armenians were actually genocided in World War I, which unfortunately we don't have time to talk about today, simply because we're not doing world history. But the Armenian genocide is something that's often overlooked. And if you've never heard of it before, please research it. It's something that you absolutely should know about. Effectively, what this point does is it guarantees Turkish sovereignty, so the nation of Turkey is guaranteed as an independent nation, but the rest of the Ottoman Empire is going to be split off and broken up. Now, that's actually what happened. Unfortunately, the way it is split off was disastrous. So I don't have a problem with this one in principle, but how it was done in execution, primarily because of the British and French decisions that were made, it did not work out so well. Although, in all fairness to Woodrow Wilson, he is not responsible for the fact that this didn't go so well. The most problematic point about number 12 is the last, and that's that the Dardanelles should remain permanently open. If you're not familiar with the Dardanelles, that is the channel between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. Again, Chromebook's handy. Go ahead and look up Constantinople. That strait of water connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea that runs by Constantinople, that is the Dardanelles. Here's the problem. That would be like declaring that the Mississippi River is open to anyone's navigation. The Chinese can sail their warships right up the Mississippi River. You say, wait a second, that's not fair. That's our waters. Well, the Dardanelles were absolutely Turkish waters. The points between Asia and Europe are incredibly small, and allowing anyone to sail any vessel they wanted through those straits would have been disastrous for the Turks. Effectively, while their freedom would have been guaranteed, any European nation could have cut them off from their capital. They could have parked ships in the straits, and if they're open and neutral, there can't be any warships or battlements of the Turks. So effectively, he's saying we're going to guarantee the Turks have a nation, but we're also going to guarantee that your nation can never possibly have any power. And so that is a mistake, I think, in his decision. Number 13, this is where the real problems of the 14 points really show up. An independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured of free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenant. This is going to be one of the, if not the, leading cause of World War II, at least an approximate case. At least as far as the actual shooting of World War II comes right back to this. Number one, Poland hadn't existed separately since the 1700s. Now, by the way, that is in no way to say that Poland didn't deserve to be its own nation. But this is undoing something that had been true for almost 150 years at this point. Poland hadn't existed. Who was Polish was a very nebulous question. And by the way, the Germans thought they had an idea who the Polish were. The French thought they had an idea who the Polish were. The Russians had their own ideas on who the Polish were. Really, it's all confused. Who are the Polish? Nobody knows. Maybe not even the Polish. The problem is that this is going to be done extremely heavy-handedly, and it's going to be done specifically to punish Germany. Effectively, Germany is going to lose territory that was never under threat from the Allies, and it's going to be given to the Poles. And to make matters worse, they are going to cut part of Germany off from the other part of Germany. In fact, if you want to see what that looks like, look up the Weimar Republic, that's spelled W-E-I-M-A-R, and look at the shape of Germany. You'll notice there is a chunk of Germany divided from the rest of Germany by Poland. Now, in case you are ever redesigning the borders of the world sometime when you become president or something like that, can I just warn you that cutting one country off with another country, cutting a country in half and putting a country in the middle is an extraordinarily bad idea. Extraordinarily bad. One of the first things that nation will want to do is connect its territory because, my goodness, the complexity of having two separate locations divided by another country, it's really just a mess. You might say, wait a second, the United States has that with Alaska, but really nobody wants to drive to Alaska, so it doesn't really count. But in general, incredibly poor decision, and this was certainly a poor decision. And remember, that's that part in there that says free and secure access to the sea. By giving them free and secure access to the sea, they effectively guaranteed conflict with the Germans. And conflict with the Germans in the Second World War, it's not going to be good. Finally, 14, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. This is the beginning of something called the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is a precursor to the United Nations. It is an alliance of different countries who work together to accomplish certain goals. The problem is that when the League of Nations was created under the ideas of Woodrow Wilson, it did not allow member states to not get involved militarily if the League decided to get involved militarily. And that means that the American Senate refused to sign any treaty that included joining the League of Nations as one of its stipulations. And by the way, the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that would end the war, required all of Wilson's 14 points, all of them. If you didn't like it, you couldn't sign it. This is going to lead to problems. Number one, the Turks, as I mentioned in point 12, they don't like it. They won't sign it. In fact, there was questions about invading Turkey. Turkey ended up actually having another war where it fought against several of its Balkan rivals to keep its territory. And at the end of that, finally, the European nations was like, fine, we'll sign a separate peace treaty, throwing out number 12 for the Turks and number 14 for the record. The United States wouldn't sign with number 14 in there. They said, we will not join the League of Nations. We are not going to get ourselves thrown into a war that we did not agree to. We will not sign it. And Woodrow Wilson campaigned for months to try and get the Senate to agree, and he actually ended up suffering a stroke and basically ending his political career. He stayed president, but he was not very functional for the rest of his career. And the United States actually signed a separate peace treaty with both Austria-Hungary and with Germany that didn't involve Wilson's own peace points. So Wilson actually failed to get the United States to sign this, which is ironic. Germany and France and Britain did, but not the United States. Now, I know that's been a lot. I know that's been a lot of political things, and we're like breaking down a treaty, and that's super boring, and I apologize. But I think it's so important for us to understand because almost all of this stuff is going to come up again in World War II. And obviously, World War II is going to change the world, and it's going to be impactful for the United States. We have our final lecture coming up on what the American GIs came back to, what had changed in the United States, what's going to change between 1919 and 1929, sometimes called the Roaring Twenties. Some people are referring to where we live now as the new Roaring Twenties. Coronavirus obviously put a damp on that, but that's what we'll be talking about in the next lecture.